what is ADHD?
Right. Simple question, but it could be a complex answer, I suppose, depending on who you speak to. So ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, strictly speaking, based on our medical terminology. And it really speaks to attentional differences and activity differences that originate in the brain. So we're talking here around neurodevelopmental differences, commencing early in life, persistent throughout all years, and really only beginning to be understood in terms of how it presents in the general population and, of course, the athlete population as well. So really talking around attention, inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, challenges with what we call executive dysfunction, being organised, being able to plan, being able to execute plans. And I suppose all of those differences and challenges then interfering with day-to-day life.
Why do you think we're hearing so much more about ADHD now?
I think you're right, awareness is growing. Our knowledge is growing, as I mentioned, around beginning to understand how this actually presents in individuals. We've had for a very long time a traditional deficit-focused understanding of ADHD, and really an evidence body that relates to a particular part of the population that basically didn't represent the rest of the population. So now that we're beginning to understand how ADHD can present, as an example of that, hyperactivity used to be considered as something where you're sort of bouncing around the room. We think of young people in schools not being able to sit still, which of course is a presentation of ADHD. But we now also know that hyperactivity can be somewhat internal. So we can have thoughts that are hyperactive. We can be flooded with thoughts. We can have difficulty managing one's thoughts and the flow and the hyperactivity that could basically occur in one's mind, I suppose. And of course, that's going to present very differently on the outside compared to externalized hyperactivity. I think too, we've got a very strong movement towards embracing differences, embracing neurodiversity. So we're moving away from that deficit focus, which has then allowed us to understand the strengths and the accommodations and all the amazing opportunities that are available when you do have these differences. And therefore, our understanding just keeps growing.
Is there any correlation between the growth of technology, the use of technology, distraction in general population, and more people getting diagnosed with ADHD? That busyness of the mind that you talk about, like, I would be lying if I said I didn't feel it, but where does that line get drawn, I guess? Well, I'm going to start off with, is there a correlation between, I guess, an increase in technology use and ADHD?
It's a tricky question to answer. And also, it's probably not my area of expertise. There are a lot of people doing research in this area in terms of the impact of technology use, the availability of social networking online. But what I would say is that there is a massive shift in how we socialise, in how we work, how we engage with our employers being almost entirely online, with the COVID pandemic and moving to remote working. I think the day-to-day life of people, and particularly the day-to-day life of young people, is ultimately different, and the availability and accessibility of technology is a huge part of that. To then draw the line to ADHD prevalence, which is what I think you're asking, is difficult because of at the same time as having this massive community population shift in day-to-day behaviour, we've also got that growing knowledge and understanding of ADHD. So I think the way in which we understand ADHD has a technology component to it, because that's the way we socialise. And the way we interact with people, obviously, is the way in which we understand whether a neurodevelopmental difference is present. So it's not an overly straightforward answer, except to say that if we were to consider anyone's day-to-day life and any young person's day-to-day life, the way in which they experience the online world is very relevant compared to what even 5 or 10 years ago, and is continuing to shift.
Yeah, I think there's Jonathan Haidt has done a lot of work in sort of technology, attention of young people. And I think it's just interesting to find where that line is drawn, because I hear just flippantly, anecdotally, people almost self-diagnosing themselves with ADHD. They're like, I can't sit still, I'm so distracted. And it's interesting to know where that diagnosis gets drawn. So how does someone tell the difference between whether they are just overly distracted right now or they actually have ADHD?
It is tricky. I think what I would say is that, again, this shift in understanding that I keep speaking about, it's been fortunate that we've had a shift in understanding individual experiences, because historically they've often presented later in life as things like anxiety or depression and a general kind of misunderstanding of the underlying cause. So whilst I recognise that there are some arguments around the risks of sort of self-identifying, there's also this amazing opportunity that we've seen for people to basically understand where their challenges lie and therefore be able to accommodate them. I think in terms of whether I've got ADHD or not as a question, that's a professional, comprehensive diagnostic assessment that is not possible to achieve without the right information sources, without the right skill set, without the right knowledge and expertise, essentially. But I guess what we're talking about here is when differences and challenges are persistent, present throughout one's life and one's early life. And I suppose too, what happens when we accommodate such differences in terms of how functional a person can be in their life. So it's not really a straightforward answer in terms of do I have ADHD or not because I've got this symptom. It is a comprehensive understanding of a human's experience, which is incredibly complex, through the lens of the appropriate expertise and professional skill.
You mentioned the challenges there. What are some of the challenges that someone who has been diagnosed with ADHD would face?
Big question, I suppose. I've talked there around the complexity of an individual's day-to-day life, and therefore the way in which ADHD can present can be hugely different. I guess some of the things that we sort of often see are relating to the activity needs. The way in which someone regulates with ADHD can be quite different to the way in which someone regulates who is neurotypical. So as a clear example of that, they may need movement breaks to be able to focus. They may need to be able to break up their sitting time when they're doing a task. I'm thinking here around homework or work activities, to be able to chunk that time and make it achievable for their attentional abilities. I think the other thing is probably around thinking about organisation and planning and the ability to have a task and accomplish it. For ADHD, that can be challenging when you've got such an amazing ability to respond to so much stimuli at once. And so what we see as sort of attention and hyperactivity is actually this amazing ability to see all different stimuli that if you were neurotypical, you perhaps wouldn't see. And therefore you've got all these responses going on at once. So it really depends on the individual, the activities they're engaged in, and also what their history has been. Maybe coming up in one of your questions, but thinking about masking here. So masking is something that we are getting far better at understanding, and that is basically one's ability to adopt traits that almost mask or camouflage our neurodivergent abilities or differences. So with ADHD, we may feel the need to engage in additional activity. We may not have that opportunity because we are required to engage in the learning environment or whatever it might be, and it then may pop up later in one's day, such as when a young person returns home, or perhaps I'm thinking here of athletes who may be required to take in information in education sessions, game plans, game strategies, skill development, compared to on-field behaviours where you're very active, you're able to move your body.
That I'm really interested in is that intersection between ADHD and sport, and where lie some of the benefits and perhaps some of the challenges for someone who has ADHD. You just mentioned there almost learning in a theoretical sense in sport. So when you're very early on trying to learn a sport, you're pretty much sort of sat down, shown how to do the skill. I even remember learning certain techniques in cricket where you're sitting there like itching, ready to go, like, yep, okay, cool, I get it, I'm ready to go, and you kind of want to go. So for someone with ADHD, that super hyper there, that's going to be much more challenging, I assume. So what are some of the benefits and challenges for athletes that have ADHD?
it's really interesting. The neurodiversity in athlete space is developing, is probably the word I would use. A lot of the understandings we've got at the moment have come from the education field, what occurs at a learning environment. The abilities to develop a new skill and master it require learning, as you said. And so we start to think about athletes and the athlete space, and what's required of an athlete is to obviously master a new skill. Athletes are also required to be, respond well to routine. They have to be able to high perform physically. They have to be able to, use energy and use activity to the extreme. These are all things we can start to understand why ADHD might be supportive of that. The other thing is, of course, the decision-making in sport. The decision-making where you can respond quick to stimuli and perhaps not have the same caution, I suppose, around the stimuli. I'm talking here around, contact sports and being able to respond in the moment. For ADHD, that can occur a lot quicker. And, I'm talking very generally here because, of course, each individual's experience will be quite different. But being able to not necessarily engage in all of the planning and all of the consequential thinking that usually characterises neurotypical populations, in ADHD populations, that rapid response can occur a lot quicker. Again, we can see how well that lends itself to something like a high-performance sport where you are rewarded for responding well, responding with a high level of activity and being able to continue focusing on a goal. I suppose that the challenges for neurodivergent populations generally is that we have environments that historically have not been neuro-inclusive, have not well understood or accommodated attentional and activity differences if we think about the classroom. And the same narrative applies to sport. I guess the challenges, again, they're hard to sum up because each individual, the experts here are people with ADHD, right? If you've got ADHD, you're an expert, and that's who we need to listen to. But as a sort of general statement, the challenge is that the neuro-inclusive environments have not been well understood and they've not been well implemented. So the way in which a person with ADHD regulates, again, focuses before a game, may very likely include activity. For a neurotypical person, it might include sort of calm, mindful space. These strategies that support ADHD differences just basically haven't been really well understood. The challenge is probably overall blanket kind of explained by a lack of neuro-inclusivity which exists across the entire population.
In a team sport, which is where both of you and I have come from, I can almost see that being almost in a changing room where if you do have someone who has ADHD, who is much more comfortable when they are hyperactive, when they are moving, when they are thinking, when everything is ramped up, that is a more calmer space for them almost. However, there are so many athletes who will get themselves to that place and almost feel like that heightened anxiety, that heightened speed is a worry for them. They do need to calm down. And you can instantly see that changing room tussle that would potentially happen, that person in the corner sort of really ramping themselves up, but the person maybe next to them or two over going, geez, I need you to calm down. That's a challenging place to be in, especially if it's, say, like a team sport. Individual sport might be different, but yeah, that for me is something that I'd never really considered. I'd never really considered that someone might need to be ramping themselves up, might need to have that to feel safer, to feel more in control, to feel more themselves. And so I guess it goes back to your point of just awareness and really understanding what that person needs, what that person requires in order to get into the best place possible.
I fully agree. And I've had the same lived experience in the two codes that I competed in. I guess these are just dynamics that exist across teams generally, aren't they? They don't necessarily relate specifically to ADHD, but of course the examples we're talking about here commonly occur in ADHD. I think certainly in Australia, I'm putting my athlete hat on now, I think certainly in Australia there's been a shift in coaching practices and high performance practices in terms of embracing individual differences. Certainly I was using the example of team travel. So team travel, sort of interstate, international travel, certainly early on in my career, the expectation was that you socialise with your teammates, that you engage in all activities, meal times together. There was this real team bonding opportunity, which, it makes sense. There's sort of strong justification for that. I think towards the end of my career, and certainly across sports more generally, there's this approach that, embraces individual differences, and that might include spending time on one's own. There are athletes who will, undoubtedly perform better when they've had time to, as you say, be themselves, engage in activities that help regulate them, bring them joy. And that may not include socialising with one's teammates for, a very long period of time before their game and their performance. So I think that shift has been really important generally in sports, to basically be able to champion difference and champion diversity generally, and that it's single uniform kind of approach. That, once again, my experience was like very, very hard coaches and, my way or the highway. It doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And I think that's a really positive step towards embracing diversity and supporting neurodivergent athletes and ADHD athletes.
Yeah, I think I have a friend who has ADHD, and I think one of the things I'm regularly saying to them is that there's almost two camps that you can fall into when you have a diagnosis. Now, I have a physical diagnosis, and I always have this similar mentality, is that you can kind of look at your diagnosis and say, okay, I'm different, I'm unique, I need to be treated differently, and that is maybe, I don't want to say pandering, but you can glorify it a little bit. Whereas I will always say, well, look at all the upsides, the benefits that you have from whatever diagnosis that you have. So from whatever condition that you might have, whether it's physical, neurodivergent, and how can you use it to your strength? So here you're talking about how can you take the strengths of someone with ADHD and be like, right, that's a different way of thinking, that's a different way of being, and how can we use that? And I think that is a great message. It's a great way of thinking, from whether it's a coaching standpoint, from actually just the athlete's mentality, their mindset, their own approach to their own self. I think finding your own super strengths within what might be deemed something different, diverse to others. Maybe even some people will share a different opinion and might find it challenging, but can you pull out the strengths and make it work for you rather than against you?
Yeah, you're spot on. And I guess the neurodiversity, it's not really a movement, it's been around for a long time, but neurodiversity generally reflects the concept that human variation exists and we embrace that variation, and that is a normal experience, I think the key thing is that we've talked about the strengths and the opportunities that ADHD provides to elite sport. We cannot ignore the fact that if you have ADHD, there are many, many environments that are not going to be supportive to your unique differences, and that provides challenges. So we don't sort of ignore the difficulties or the challenges, but we see them as an environmental lack of accommodations as opposed to deficits that the individual needs to overcome. I think that's really important, and I think that's the way forward for sport. How do we build inclusive spaces, as we do with a whole range of different presentation and differences? How do we build neuro-inclusive spaces in which people can be their best selves? And that, obviously includes ADHD.
You mentioned masking. I just want to sort of circle back to it because firstly, what is masking? And then secondly, why was it, and I think, forgive me if I butcher it, but it was more prevalent in females to present masking. So why would that be?
That's what we think. I mean, the evidence is continuously evolving. So masking or camouflaging is basically the adopting of neurotypical traits. So neurotypical is the word that we use to describe the general population that doesn't include ADHD, autism, and other neurodivergent differences. And so the understanding of masking is that, we adopt traits to essentially blend in. we're aware of differences causing difficulties, and, you know, particularly for young people or for anyone really, we aspire to be like others around us. And that sort of social pressure and expectation has led to this concept of masking camouflaging, where we basically don't let our differences surface in the way that perhaps we more naturally would if we had accommodations and supportive environments. In terms of the point there around women and girls seeming to engage more in masking camouflaging, I think masking camouflaging affects all people. I think that the kind of justification for that is that, I guess, women and girls, there is the hypothesis, are more sort of sensitive to societal and social expectations. There is a greater pressure to conform, particularly from, say, like a gendered approach. And ultimately, the consequences historically, and still currently, for being neurodivergent have been quite severe. If you've not been able to learn in the same way as your peers have learned, then you are often branded not able to, you know, acquire knowledge. And then, of course, we start to see why beliefs develop, such as, well, I'm not smart enough. So masking and camouflaging it's a concept that we aim to unpick when someone undergoes an assessment or for a diagnosis, whereby the underlying traits and differences that might be present may be hidden somewhat so based on that person's social experiences of being required to not show those differences.
So interesting that you think as well with the sort of hyperactivity of someone with ADHD and neurodivergence that you might, if you form some form of limiting belief around yourself early on, that I wonder whether that the way in which their mind works then really grabs a hold of it, like it would with anyone, right? Anyone that has a limiting belief about themselves will overthink about that, will self-deprecate themselves over and over again. I mean, we all do it, but potentially for someone with ADHD, that is just exponential or fast forwarded a lot more.
Yeah, I think it just comes back to that environmental fit, you know. If you repeatedly don't fit into the environment because the environment is not supportive of your attentional, your activity, your executive functional differences, then, you know, you've got evidence to sort of support those beliefs. And then that can just get repeated and re-emphasized through all these different environments, you know, including as you enter adulthood, basically. And then I think in terms of, you know, well, particularly for athletes, identity is such a big thing as well. And so there's definitely benefits of having an identity that helps us survive in our environments. That's just sort of a basic survival theory, isn't it? And yeah, unpicking all of that and helping us understand that these are differences that, hold incredible strengths and also experience, you know, significant difficulties because we're just beginning to understand how we best support these differences and allow people to thrive.
I'd never considered the decision-making part to ADHD as well. The fact that they may make decisions a lot faster and sort of mitigate some of that overthinking around the negative consequences or consequences in general. But I think of just the average athlete that I'm speaking to is mostly riddled with fear of failure. A lot of my research is going into perfectionism and just fear of failure being a huge part of that, and the procrastination that takes place when you have all of these negative thoughts around the consequential outcomes of an action. And I think that is a part of that superpower that would exist within someone who potentially has ADHD and is in sport, is that you can almost do and then ask questions later, because there's so many athletes I know that sit in the other camp, which is, I wish I'd made that shot, or I wish I'd taken that moment, and I wish I hadn't taken so long over it. And yeah, that for me is something I never considered, actually, even before this conversation, that how that decision-making process could be quicker. It'd be really interesting, like, for future research, because I know even in your paper that it came out saying there is much research to be done in this area, especially around sport, but in general. But it'd be so interesting to understand those that potentially have been diagnosed with a neurodiversity, ADHD, have what their levels of fear of failure are when it comes down to decision making. But it'd be so interesting to see something like that.
Oh, there's just so many unanswered questions. We don't even know what the prevalence is of ADHD in athlete cohorts. I mean, we're still at the epidemiological questions, we have a bit of a sense as to what prevalence might be, but then of course that's constantly changing because our diagnostic measures are getting a lot better, getting better unpicking, camouflaging and masking that previously an ADHD assessment possibly wouldn't have picked up. So I think probably there's a lot of first steps for the research. Our paper found quite a lot of research in the ADHD and concussion space. There was the medical management of ADHD and sort of viewpoints and commentaries on that, and very, very little literature on the lived experience of neurodivergent athletes generally, which included ADHD. And so I mentioned before that the experts here, we cannot overemphasize the importance of the lived experience of ADHD athletes and learning what their experiences are. So we've got lots of unanswered questions, but we've got some great principles and learnings, I suppose, from the education space as to how we progress in this field. Certainly our current work is looking at the way in which neuroinclusivity can be strengthened in elite sporting communities, and the starting point is partnering with ADHD autistic athletes as well and understanding their experiences, which may very well include something like perfectionism.
So from your own point of view, where do we go from here with, say, ADHD, whether it's the research, whether it's the inclusivity of it? And I guess, how do we also balance the fact that we don't know the prevalence of it? Potentially there's people out there that have been undiagnosed. And how do we balance diagnosing people and then giving them the right support and challenge so that it doesn't become a crutch in their life, but it can also become something that unlocks a lot of these benefits, a lot of these, overcoming of the challenges that we've spoken about?
I think there's multiple first steps, as I mentioned. There's absolutely being informed by the principles of human rights, making sure that we are co-designing research with people with lived experience, that we are affirming in the way in which we embrace diversity, neurodiversity. I think there's absolutely the argument, or there's absolutely the need for supporting individual athletes, understanding the challenges they face. And then we have our environments. We have sporting systems that need inclusive policies, that need a basic understanding and awareness of neurodiversity generally, and in particular ADHD, because there are challenges. And then, of course, as you say, there are all these incredible opportunities to, support the well-being of people, but also unlock high performance benefits as well, which is, such a common quest across all sporting codes. So we need the individual approach, of course, to mitigate the challenges and the, some of the comorbidities that occur with ADHD. And then we need sporting systems that enable people to thrive, knowing that it's very likely there is a proportion of athletes, if not a large proportion of athletes, with ADHD within those systems.
Just as a general, I know a lot of your research has focused around mental health as well. Just in your opinion, where do you feel the landscape currently sits with mental health in sport?
Do you mean the landscape is in where are we at and where are we heading next? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, where are we at? Yeah, where do you think we're currently at with mental health in sport right now?
We know that athletes are members of the general population, and that we know that mental health exists for all people and mental health disorders exist across all populations. We're also now understanding that approaches which only focus on treatment are unlikely to fully support systems in which mental health is best supported. So we have athlete-focused interventions that are really supportive, mental health awareness, mental health treatment when required, and then we have high-performance environments that can support those athletes. So we've got absolutely increased awareness. We've got reduced stigma for sure. We've still got quite a while to go, but it is reducing, I would say, at least in the circles that I've been a part of. And then to support all of that, we are beginning to see, as I just mentioned before, these policies which are ultimately supportive of mentally healthy cultures, That's really the aim here, is to have a system that can support people, when they're having really significant difficulties, and then also offset some of the risks and prevent some of the challenges before they occur. So it's really that prevention through to intervention approach that we're beginning to see, and absolutely supported by the evidence and best practice approaches for public health generally.
And for you, what's coming up on the horizon for you? Is there anything that's research-wise that you're really looking forward to getting your teeth stuck into? You've recently left professional sport, so I guess what's on the horizon for you? How are you getting on with life outside sport? You'd also mentioned that you were playing sport whilst juggling a career, so that's not very common for sure. But what's going on in the world for you, Erin?
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to speak to myself. I guess I've had the privilege of being involved in women's sport and seeing the progression over a sort of good decade, I suppose, which has just seen such huge changes, going from a space where it was very, very little pay, very much semi-professional, all the way through to last year was my final year in Australian football, and, very much moving towards fully professional. So the women's sport generally is a really exciting space. I was, again, privileged to be able to have the opportunity to have a career alongside sport, and I guess not having that can prove challenging once you leave the elite sporting space. I absolutely see my role now, and I guess my energy is going towards advocating for embracing diversity, specifically neurodiversity, making sure, as I've mentioned a few times, we're partnering with people that have this lived experience day to day. In schools, that's families and students, ADHD, autistic, neurodivergent students. And in sporting communities, that's our athletes and our high-performance spaces. So I guess advocating for that neuro-inclusivity, it's a broad goal, and there's a lot of steps to get there. But, ultimately it's around supporting people to be well and being the best people they can be and being the best athletes they can be.
Well, this has been amazing to have you on. I'm not sure how many podcasts that you've been on, but this was amazing to be able to talk to you about this subject and really dive into it. I would love to have gone on for longer. You've spoken about it brilliantly, and like you said, there's so much to be done in this space, and I know that there will be people listening will take a lot from it, just whether it's solace or whether it's just the fact they're learning something new. So thank you so much for your time, Erin. Where's the best place for people to follow this work, research, catch up on things that you're getting stuck into?
It's a great question. Thank you for having me on. It's such an amazing space to be working in, and it is a privilege. I've used that a few times, but it is a privilege to be able to work in this space. I think absolutely, obviously our traditional kind of research outputs are on Google Scholar and whatnot. The Conversation is a great place where research is communicated, and then sort of your obviously your news outlets and things. But hopefully we can work towards some sort of consensus work internationally across sporting codes. That's really where we want to get to, is to be able to have policies and frameworks and consensus on how our ADHD athletes and our neurodivergent athletes can best succeed. So absolutely watch this space.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been great to have you.
Thank you so much, Lewis. I appreciate it.
If you've enjoyed that episode with Erin and you want to see more episodes of the show, we've created a Start Here playlist with some of the best episodes for you to get going with right away. All you got to do is click right here. Go.